So students, for this demonstration, I'm going to try to show you what glazing means, what exactly that means and how it works. Some people have kind of been confused about that in the past. And glazing basically means using a very transparent layer of paint. And it's a way to create depth. If you think of this, I have this set up here. These are two underpaintings that I did. This one I used a yellow ochre stain for my ground, and then I used burnt sienna in very transparent layers to build up values, to create the sort of value painting that you guys are going to do when you're underpainting. This one, same sort of idea. This time I limited it to just burnt sienna, and then I glazed on some very transparent layers of raw umber as a way to make the darker tonal values. I did make some darker tonal values in just burnt sienna, but I increased them a little bit by adding some glazing. I went a little too dark here, I think, but you get the idea. So these are very early stages of the painting, and this is what you're going to work on top of. So now I would mix colors for this particular vase or, bottle, whatever it is that I'm going to do, and try to bring it forward, and I might try to push the background back. One thing that I can do is, to make this seem more luminous or to come more forward, is I could create a glaze, a transparent layer, and just slightly darken everything behind it. And that, using the rule of relative value, should bring the subject matter forward. Think of it like theater. These guys are on the stage, they deserve more light and more presence, and then you want kind of an atmosphere or a sense of depth behind them. Okay, so back to the idea of making a glaze. One last thing. The other thing we want to sort of talk about too is the difference between transparent paints like glazes and opaque paints like flesh tones, for example. In fact, I'm probably going to use some of the flesh tone that I made earlier to attempt the bottle. Transparent layers allow light to basically penetrate into the layers of paint. It kind of gets captured there and sort of glows. And so it's more of an ambient sort of light, sort of an atmospheric light. Where with opaque paints, the light hits the surface of those opaque layers and bounces off immediately. So you get a much more sort of direct reflection on the painting. And so those things seem to be closer. They feel closer and they reflect more brilliantly. Both of them are super cool. And I think this is what, the old masters really played with, this kind of idea of, creating spatial depth just with the different types of painting or different types of paints that they were using. So for my glazing medium, I could just use straight Galkid. However, I'm gonna modify mine just a little bit by adding what's called stand oil. Stand oil just helps brush strokes sort of mellow out, and that way things blend together easier and slows the drying time down a little bit, which is not a bad idea when you're doing your final layers of glazing. Okay, now what I mixed here was that color I showed you before, where I used cadmium red light, which is basically an orange, and phthalo blue mixed together. And I got this sort of, neutral chromatic grayish color. And I pushed it a little bit towards the blue side because I wanted it to be cooler. I want it to be cooler because I'm glazing over a warm color. I'm gonna go ahead and leave this one as is, and I'm gonna probably do some work here. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do a glaze. You can either take your brush and dip it in here a lot and just pick up tiny bits of paint at a time and just sort of, keep blending and mixing it around. Or if you have a big area to work on, you might want to actually make a dedicated glaze cup where you add just a little bit of that paint in there. And I mean a little, because if you put too much, it won't be transparent enough. In fact, I already think I did. Gosh darn it. And then mix it up. but we'll test it to see. So now I'm mixing my Galkid, my stand oil, in this sort of bluish tone. Let's see what it looks like. See how thin it can be? It's a very thin, almost gray, but bluish, transparent layer. Very transparent. So I'm going to attempt to bring my subject matter forward by glazing back the background. In fact, there's a funny story. I think it was a Rembrandt portrait where he was painting a portrait of a woman and she had a pearl necklace on, or a necklace with a pearl in it or something. And he just could not figure out how to make that pearl more luminous. He really wanted to emphasize that, and it wasn't, he could come up with no other solution, but basically to make a transparent glaze and glaze back the entire painting except for that one pearl so that it became brighter than everything else. And it apparently worked. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this on very thin. And you can see the background just starts to become darker, just in shades. And of course, by darkening the background, the bottle in the foreground seems to come forward more. Okay, so now you can see that by just simply adding that very thin layer of glazing medium into the background, it pushes the background back, makes it darker. And I could let this dry and I could, decide later, well, maybe I want it darker still. I could either make a different color, make it really complex with, different variations of light, or I could add more of the same and just layer it up. And the more I layer, the darker it gets, kind of like an ink wash, okay? The important part though is that it's transparent and then you never put any white into it. Adding white to a glazing medium will make it milky and sort of muddy, and it doesn't have that transparent quality that you want. And the cool thing about it is because I worked over this, orangey brown, the burnt sienna, it's sort of coming through and making sort of complex compound color. And I don't know, just adds to the sort of visual complexity of the piece. Now, I could also use this on cast shadows. Now, it wouldn't necessarily work right now because these cast shadows are dark enough, but I'll show you here in a minute maybe how I would approach that. First though, I want to go back to the idea of using opaque paints. So I have already mixed this kind of flesh tone here. I'm going to go ahead and use this. All right, so right now I have sort of a brush that's got really soft bristles. I'm not going to add any medium to my white or to my opaque color. I'm going to go ahead and just blend it on straight. And the reason is I want it to stay wet and be able to manipulate it for a long time. You could choose to put a little bit of medium in it if you want to, but I think it's better. So when using opaque layers, this is when you get the idea of more scumbling. And that's where you kind of like feathering those colors out. Feather them out so that they're also sort of transparent in some regard. Because that way you can, if you wish, use some of the underpainting and let it come through. To be honest, I would typically, since, you know, I'm doing a video, I kind of have to, I would typically paint this first and then glaze back, but it doesn't hurt. The only problem is I run the risk of these two wet layers meeting and kind of melting together. I don't want that to happen, so I'm just going to be extra careful. So the scumbling effect, you can see by adding this paint on very thinly and kind of scumbling it back and forth, I can get like almost a veil, a very thin layer that's still somewhat transparent. And the cool thing about that is you get the color of the underpainting coming through. And notice how I retain the aspect of the shadow. I haven't even bothered mixing any darker colors. I'm just using sort of the stuff from underneath. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only way of doing this, because it isn't. You know, you can mix the different colors of your bottle, but just in this method of trying to keep things transparent enough but keeping it transparent enough that some of those complex reddish browns come through as well. So essentially that is the idea behind glazing, transparent layers, and scumbling more opaque layers in a very thin manner so that your underpainting still comes through and can have an effect on the painting. And it'd be surprising how little pigment and paint you can actually use and really bring some of these colors up. Now, this doesn't mean this is the final touches, and there's definitely things that I can do to this after it dries. Now, glazing doesn't have to always be cool. It can sometimes be warm depending on the application. Let's say you're doing a face. Sometimes you're doing a face and there's a shadow and you want to deepen it, but that shadow for some reason is a little more orange or brown. You know, you might want to glaze like an oranger color over the top of that shadow to deepen a shadow on the face. Or even something as silly as like, maybe there's more, I don't know, rosy color in the cheeks and you didn't quite capture that the first time you put the flesh tones down. You can make a very thin glaze and just glaze a tiny transparent layer of that red over the cheeks to get that ruddy look in. Now I'm gonna go over to this painting, this other example on this side, to sort of show you, just for fun, how I could deepen these by just adding glaze. Okay, so for on this side, rather than glazing back the background, I went ahead and showed you glazing into the shadows and how these reds become more complex, these reddish browns, once you add the cool glaze over the top. And vice versa, if you have cool shadows, you can glaze warm glazes over the top of those and deepen them even more. So just enhance them, make them darker. You feel like they weren't dark enough the first time, and you want them to have more sort of depth to them, you can add this very thin glazing layer to make that happen. And I added a little bit here to the corner of the table just to create a little bit more atmosphere, and then a tiny bit here. And it just kind of makes the colors more complex. And again, so easy because it's just one color and a transparent medium. Scumbling, glazing back the background, and then glazing shadows. And just as a final PS, one thing that I just want to make sure that I made clear. When I scumbled over here and I scumbled into these shadows, you notice how kind of milky and weird they look? They do have a tonal value range, but they don't feel like how a shadow floats on a surface. Not like this shadow, and especially these cast shadows would look really crummy if I added that scumbling into it. But that's okay, because I have a plan, and after it dries, then I would do what I did over here, and I would glaze those shadows over the top, and they would feel a lot more, transparent and they float on the surface like a real shadow does. And then finally, I kind of neglected my acrylic painters, but I had you buy this acrylic glazing medium, and that's exactly what it's for. This is what you use for your glazing.